While metals flowed unceasingly from Latin American mines, equally unceasing were the orders from the Spanish court granting paper protection and dignity to the Indians whose killing labor sustained the kingdom. The fiction of legality protected the Indians. The reality of exploitation drained the blood from his body. From slavery to encomienda of service, and from this to the encomienda of tribute and regime of wages, variance in the Indian labor force's judicial condition made only superficial changes in the real situation. The Crown regarded the inhuman exploitation of Indian labor as so necessary that in 1601 Philip III, banning forced labor in the mines by decree, at the same time sent secret instructions ordering its continuation, quote, in case that measure should reduce production. Similarly, between 1616 and 1619, Governor Juan de Solorzano carried out a survey of work conditions in the Huancavelica mercury mines directly exploited by the Crown. In distinction to the silver mines, which were in private hands, the poison penetrated to the very marrow, debilitating all the members and causing a constant shaking, and the workers usually died within 4 years. He reported to the Council of the Indies and to the King. But in 1631, Philip IV ordered that the same system be continued, and his successor Charles II later reaffirmed the decree. In 3 centuries, Potosi's Cerro Rico consumed 8 million lives. The Indians, including women and children, were torn from their agricultural communities and driven to the Cerro. Of every 10 who went up into the freezing wilderness, 7 never returned. Luis Capoche, an owner of mines and mills, wrote that the roads were so covered with people that the whole kingdom seemed on the move. In their communities, the Indians saw many afflicted women returning without husbands and with many orphan children, and they knew that 1,000 deaths and disasters awaited them in the mines. The Spaniards scoured the countryside for hundreds of miles for labor. Many died on the way before reaching Potosi, but it was the terrible work conditions in the mine that killed the most people. Soon after the mine began operating in 1550, the Dominican monk Domingo de Santo Tomas told the Council of the Indians that Potosi was a mouth of hell, which swallowed Indians by the thousands every year, and that rapacious mine owners treated them like stray animals. Later, Fray Rodrigo de Loaisa said, these poor Indians are like sardines in the sea. Just as other fish pursue the sardines to seize and devour them, so everyone in these lands pursues the wretched Indians. Chiefs of Indian communities had to replace the constantly dying Matayos with new men between 18 and 50 years old. The huge stone-walled corral where Indians were assigned to mine and mill owners is now used by workers as a football ground. The Matayos jail, a shapeless mass of ruins, can still be seen at the entrance to Potosi. The compilation of the laws of the Indies abounds with decrees establishing the equal right of Indians and Spaniards to exploit the mines, and expressly forbidding any infringement of Indian rights. Thus formal history, the dead letter of today, which perpetuates the dead letter of the past, has nothing to complain about. But while Indian labor legislation was debated in endless documents and Spanish jurists displayed their talents in an explosion of ink, in Latin America the law was respected but not carried out. Quote, in practice, quote, the poor Indian is a coin with which one can get whatever one needs, as with gold and silver, and get it better, end quote, as Luis Capoche put it. Many people claimed mestizo status before the courts to avoid being sent to the mines and sold and resold in the market. At the end of the 18th century, Corvo, who had Indian blood, denied his own people. We do not dispute that the mines consume a considerable number of Indians, but this is not due to the work they do in the silver and mercury mines, but to their dissolute way of life. End quote. The testimony of Capoche, who had many Indians in his service, is more enlightening. Freezing outdoor temperatures alternated with the infernal heat inside the Cerro. Indians went into the depths and, quote, and it is common to bring them out dead or with broken heads and legs. And in the mills they are injured every day, end quote. The Matayos hacked out the metal with picks and then carried it up on their shoulders by the light of a candle. Outside the mine, they propelled the heavy wooden shafts in the mill or melted the silver on a fire after grinding and washing it. The Mita labor system was a machine for crushing Indians. The process of using mercury to extract silver poisoned as many or more than did the toxic gases in the bowels of the earth. It made hair and teeth fall out and brought on uncontrollable trembling. The victims ended up dragging themselves through the streets pleading for alms. At night, 6,000 fires burned on the slopes of the Cerro, and in these the silver was worked. Taking advantage of the wind that the glorious St. Augustine sent from the sky, because of the smoke from the ovens there were no pastures or crops for a radius of 20 miles around Potosi, and the fumes attacked men's bodies no less relentlessly. Ideological justifications were never in short supply. The bleeding of the New World became an act of charity, an argument for the faith. With the guilt, a whole system of rationalizations for guilty consciences was devised. The Indians were used as beasts of burden because they could carry a greater weight than the delicate llama, and this proved that they were in fact beasts of burden. The Viceroy of Mexico felt that there was no better remedy for their natural wickedness than work in the mines. Juan Inés de Sepulveda, a renowned Spanish theologian, argued that they deserved the treatment they got because their sins and idolatries were an offense to God. The Count de Buffon, a French naturalist, noted that Indians were cold and weak creatures in whom, quote, no activity of the soul could be observed. There are the quotes up there too. And the Abbe de Paul invented a Latin America where degenerate Indians lived side by side with dogs that couldn't bark, cows that couldn't be eaten, and impotent camels. Voltaire's Latin America was inhabited by Indians who were lazy and stupid, pigs with navels on their backs, and bald and cowardly lions. Bacon de Maistre, Montesquieu, Hume, and Bodin declined to recognize the degraded men. Montaigne did. Montaigne was skeptical. The degraded men, quote, of the New World as fellow humans. Hegel spoke of Latin America's physical and spiritual impotence, or whatever, and said the Indians died when Europe merely breathed on them. In the 17th century, Father Gregorio Garcia detected Semitic blood in the Indians because, like the Jews, they are, quote, they are lazy, they do not believe in the miracles of Jesus Christ, and they are ungrateful to the Spaniards for all the good they have done them. At least, quote, or end quote. Sorry. Yeah, at least this holy man did not deny that the Indians were descended from Adam and Eve. Many theologians and thinkers had never been convinced by Pope Paul III's bull of 1537 declaring the Indians to be true men. When Bartolomé de las Casas upset the Spanish court with his heated denunciations of the conquistadors' cruelty in 1557, a member of the royal council replied that Indians were too low in the human scale to be capable of receiving the faith. Las Casas dedicated his zealous life to defending the Indians against the excesses of the mine owners and encomenderos. He once remarked that the Indians preferred to go to hell to avoid meeting Christians. Indians were assigned or given an encomienda to conquistadors and colonizers so that they could teach them the gospel, but since the Indians owed personal services and economic tribute to the encomenderos, there was little time for setting them on the Christian path to salvation. Indians were divided up along with lands given as royal grants or were obtained by direct plunder in reward for his service. Cortez received 23,000 vassals. After 1536, Indians were given an encomienda along with their descendants for the span of 2 lifetimes, those of encomendero and his immediate heir. After 1629, this was extended to 3 lifetimes, and after 1704 to 4. In the 18th century, the surviving Indians still assured many generations to come of a cozy life. Since their defeated gods persisted in Spanish memory, there were saintly rationalizations aplenty for the victor's profits from their toil. The Indians were pagans and deserved nothing better. The past 40 years after the papal bull in September 1957, the highest court in Paraguay published a notice informing all the judges of the country that quote, the Indians, like other inhabitants of the Republic, are human beings, end quote. And the Center for Anthropological Studies of the Catholic University of Asunción later carried out a revealing survey, both in the capital and in the countryside. 8 out of 10 Paraguayans think that, quote, Indians are animals, end quote. In Caraguaza, Alta Parana, and the Chaco, Indians are hunted down like wild beasts, sold at bargain prices, and exploited by a system of virtual slavery. Yet almost all Paraguayans have Indian blood. And Paraguayans tirelessly compose poems, songs, and speeches in homage of the Guardian soul. The militant memory of Tupac Amaru. When the Spaniards invaded Latin America, the theoretic Inca Empire was at its height, spreading over what we now call Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, taking in part of Colombia and Chile, and reaching northern Argentina and the Brazilian jungle. The Aztec Confederation had achieved a high level of efficiency in the Valley of Mexico and in Yucatan and Central America. The remarkable civilization of the Mayas, organized for work and war, persisted among the peoples who succeeded them. Those societies have left many testimonies to their greatness despite the long period of devastation. Religious monuments built with more skill than the Egyptian pyramids, technically efficient constructions for the battle against nature, artworks showing indomitable talent. In the Lima Museum, there are hundreds of skulls which have undergone trepanning and the insertion of gold and silver plates by Inca surgeons. The Mayas were great astronomers, measuring time and space with astonishing precision, and discovered the value of the figure 0 before any other people in history. The Aztecs' irrigation works, artificial islands, dazzled Cortez, even though they were not made of gold. The conquest shattered the foundations of these civilizations. The installation of a mining company had dire consequences than the fire and sword of war. Mines required a great displacement of people and dislocated agricultural communities. They not only took countless lives through forced labor, but also indirectly destroyed the collective farming system. The Indians were taken to the mines, were forced to submit to the service of the encomenderos, and were made to surrender for nothing the lands which they had to leave or neglect. On the Pacific coast, the Spaniards destroyed or let die out the enormous plantations of corn, yucca, kidney, and white beans, peanuts, and sweet potato. The desert quickly devoured great tracts of land which the Inca irrigation network had made abundant. 4.5 centuries after the conquest, only rocks and briars remained, where roads had once united an empire. Although the Incas' great public works were for the most part destroyed by time or the usurper's hand, one may still see across the Andean Cordillera traces of the endless terraces which permitted and still permit cultivation of the mountainsides. A U.S. technician estimated in 1936 that if the Inca terraces had been built by modern methods in 1936 wage rates, they would have cost some $30,000 per acre. In that empire which did not know the wheel, the horse, or iron, the terraces and aqueducts were made possible by prodigious organization and technical perfection achieved through wise distribution of labor, as well as by the religious force that ruled man's relation with the soil, which was sacred and thus always alive. The Aztecs also responded in a remarkable way to nature's challenges. The surviving islands in the dried-up lake where Mexico City now rises on native ruins are known to tourists today as floating gardens. The Aztecs created these because of the shortage of land in the place chosen for establishing Tenochtitlan. They moved large quantities of mud from the banks and shored up the new mud islands between narrow walls of reeds until tree roots gave them firmness. Between these exponentially fertile islands flowed the canals, and on them arose the great Aztec capital with its broad avenues, its austerely beautiful palaces, and its stepped pyramids rising magically out of the lake. It was condemned to disappear under the assaults of foreign conquest. Mexico took 4 centuries to regain the population of those times. As Darcy Ribeiro puts it, the Indians were the fuel of the colonial productive system. Quote, it is almost certain that hundreds of Indians, sculptors, architects, engineers, and astronomers were sent into the mines along with the massive slaves for the killing task of getting out the ore. The technical ability of these people was of no interest to the colonial economy. They were treated as so many skilled workers. Sergio Babu. Yet all traces of those broken cultures were not lost. Hope of the rebirth of a lost dignity sparked many Indian risings. In 1781, Tupac Amaru laid siege to Cuzco. This Maestro chief, a direct descendant of the Inca emperors, headed the broadest of messianic revolutionary movements. The rebellion broke out in Tinta province, which had been almost depopulated by enforced service in the Cerro Rico mines. Mounted on his white horse, Tupac Amaru entered the plaza of Tungascuska and announced to the sound of drums and puches that he had condemned the royal carrero Antonio Juan de Arregara, to the gallows and put an end to the Potosi Mita. A few days later, Tupac issued a decree liberating the slaves. He abolished all taxes and forced labor in all forms. The Indians rallied by the thousands to the forces of the quote, father of all the poor and all the wretched and helpless. End quote. He moved against Cuzco at the head of his guerrillas, promising them that all who died under his orders in this war would return to life to enjoy the happiness and wealth the invaders had wrested from them. Victories and defeats followed. In the end, betrayed and captured by one of his own chiefs, Tupac was handed over in chains to the royalists. The examiner Ariche entered his cell to demand in exchange for promises the names of his rebel accomplices. Tupac Amaru replied scornfully, quote, there are no accomplices here other than you and I. You as oppressor, I as liberator, deserve to die. Tupac was tortured along with his wife, his children, and his chief aides. In Cusco's Plaza del Huacaipata, his tongue was cut out, his arms and legs were tied to 4 horses with the intention of quartering him, but his body would not break. He was finally beheaded at the foot of the gallows. His head was sent to Tinta, one arm to Tungusaca, and the other to Carabaya, one leg to Santa Rosa, and the other to Levitica. The torso was burned and the ashes thrown into the Rio Watane. It was proposed that all his descendants be obliterated up to the 4th generation. In 1802, a chief named Astorpilco, also a descendant of the Incas, was visited by Humboldt in Cajamarca on the exact spot where his ancestor Arthropa had first seen the conquistador Pizarro. The chief's son took the German scholar out on a tour of the ruins of this town and the rubble of the old Inca palace, and spoke as they walked of the fabulous treasures hidden beneath the dust and ashes. Quote, don't you sometimes feel like digging for the treasure to satisfy your needs? Humboldt asked him. The youth replied, no, we never feel like doing that. My father says it would be sinful. If we were to find the golden branches and fruits, the white people would hate us and do us harm. The chief himself raised wheat in a small field, but that was not enough to save him from white covetousness. The usurpers, hungry for gold and silver and for slaves to work the mines, never hesitated to seize lands when their crops offered a tempting profit. The plunder continued down the years, and in 1969, when agrarian reform was announced in Peru, reports still appeared in the press of Indians from the broken mountain communities coming with flags unfurled to invade lands that had been robbed from them or their ancestors, and of the army driving them away with bullets. Nearly 2 centuries had to pass after Tupac Amaru's death before the nationalist General Juan Velasco Alvarado would take up and apply Tupac's resounding, never-forgotten words, "Campesino, your poverty shall no longer feed the master." Other heroes whose defeat was reversed by time were the Mexican Miguel Hidalgo and Jose Maria Morelos. Hidalgo, who till the age of 50 was a peaceful rural peasant, pealed the bells of the Church of Dolores one fine day to summon the Indians to fight for their freedom. "Will you stir yourselves to the task of recovering from the hated Spaniards the lands robbed from your ancestors 300 years ago?" He raised the standard of the Indian Virgin of Guadalupe, and before 6 weeks out, 80,000 men were following him, armed with machetes, pikes, slings, and bows and arrows. The revolutionary priest put an end to tribute and divided up the lands of Guadalajara. He decreed freedom for the slaves and led his forces toward Mexico City. He was finally executed after military defeat and is said to have left a testament of passionate repentance. The revolution soon found another leader, however, the priest Jose Maria Morelos. Quote, "You must regard as enemies all the rich, the nobles, and high-ranking officials." His movement, combining Indian insurgency and social revolution, came to control a large part of Mexico before he too was defeated and shot. As one U.S. Senator wrote, "The independence of Mexico 6 years later, quote, turned out to be a typically Hispanic family affair between European and American-born members, a political fight within the dominating social class," unquote. The encomienda serf became a peon, and the encomendero a hacienda owner. Masters of Indian pongos, domestic servants, were still offering them for hire in La Paz newspaper at the beginning of our century. Until the revolution of 1952 restored the forgotten right of dignity to Bolivian Indians, the pongo slept beside the dog, ate the leftovers of his dinner, and knelt when speaking to anyone with a white skin. Four-legged beasts of burden were scarce in the conquistadors' time, and they used Indian backs of transport their baggage. Even to this day, Aymara and Quechua porters can be seen all over Andean Altiplano carrying loads for a crust of bread. Pneumoconiosis was Latin America's occupational disease, and the lungs of today's Bolivian miner refused to continue functioning at the age of 35. The implacable silica dust impregnates his skin, cracks his face and hands, destroys his sense of smell and taste, hardens and kills his lungs. Tourists love to photograph Altiplano natives in their native costumes, unaware that these were imposed by Charles III at the end of the 18th century. The dresses that the Spaniards made Indian females wear were copied from the regional costumes of Extremaduran, Andalusian, and Basque peasant women, and the center part hairstyle was imposed by Viceroy Toledo. The same was not true of the consumption of coca, which already existed in Inca times, but coca was then distributed in moderation. The Inca government had a monopoly on it and only permitted its use for ritual purposes or for those who worked in the mines. The Spaniards energetically stimulated its consumption. It was good business. In Potosi in the 16th century, as much was spent on European clothes for the oppressors as on coca for the oppressed. In Cusco, 400 Spanish merchants lived off the coca traffic. In Cusco, 400 Spanish merchants lived off the coca traffic. Every year, 100,000 baskets with 1 million kilos of coca leaf entered the Potosi silver mines, and Church took a tax from the drug. The Inca historian Garcilaso de la Vega tells us in his Comentarios Reales que tratan del origen de los Incas that the bishop, canons, and other Cusco church dignitaries got most of their income from tithes on coca, and that the transport and sale of the product enriched many Spaniards. For the few coins they received for their work, the Incas brought coca leaf instead of food. Chewing it, they could, at the price of shortening their lives, better endure the deadly tasks imposed on them. In addition to coca, the Indians drank potent aguardiente, and their owners complained of the propagation of maleficent vices. In 20th century Potosi, the Indians still chew coca to kill hunger in themselves and still burn their guts with pure alcohol, sterile forms of revenge for the condemned. Bolivian miners still call their wages mita, as in olden days. Exiled in their own land, condemned to an eternal exodus, Latin America's native peoples were pushed into the poorest areas, arid mountains, the middle of deserts, as the dominant civilization extended its frontiers. The Indians have suffered and continue to suffer the curse of their own wealth. That is the drama of all Latin America. When placer gold was discovered in Nicaragua's Rio Bluefields, the Carca Indians were quickly expelled far from their riparian lands, and the same happened with the Indians in the fertile valleys and rich subsoil lands south of the Rio Grande. The massacres of Indians that began with Columbus never stopped. In Uruguay and Argentine Patagonia, they were exterminated during the last century by troops that hunted them down and penned them in forests or in the desert so that they might not disturb the organized advance of cattle latifundia. The Yaqui Indians of the Mexican state of Sonora were drowned in blood so that their lands, fertile and rich in minerals, could be sold without any unpleasantness to various U.S. capitalists. Survivors were deported to plantations in Yucatan, and the Yucatan Peninsula became not only the cemetery of the Mayas, who had been its owners, but also the Yaquis, who had come from afar. At the beginning of our century, the 50 kings of Peniquin had more than 100,000 Indian slaves on their plantations. Despite the exceptional physical endurance of the strapping, handsome Yaquis, 2/3 of them died during the first year of labor. In our day, Peniquin can compete with synthetic fiber substitutes only because of the workers' as abysmally low standard of living. Things have certainly changed, but not as much, at least for the natives of Yucatan, as some believe. Quote, "The living conditions of these workers are much like slave labor," says one contemporary authority. On the Andean slopes near Bogota, the Indian peon still must give a day's work without pay to get the haciendado's permission to farm his own plot on moonlit nights. As René Dumont says, the Indians' ancestors, answering to no man, used once to cultivate the rich soil of the ownerless plain. Now he works for nothing to gain the right to cultivate the poor slopes of the mountain. Not even Indians isolated in the depths of forests are safe in our day. At the beginning of the century, 230 tribes survived in Brazil. Since then, 90 have disappeared, erased from the planet by firearms and microbes, violence and disease, the advance guard of civilization. For the Indian, contact with the white man continues to be contact with death. Every legal dispensation since 1537 meant to protect Brazil's Indians has been turned against them. Under every Brazilian constitution, they are, quote, the original and natural masters, quote, end quote, of the land they occupy. But the richer that virgin land proves to be, the greater the threat hanging over their lives. Nature's very generosity makes them targets of plunder and crime. Indian hunting has become ferocious in recent years. The world's greatest forest, a huge tropical zone open to legend and adventure, has inspired a new, quote, American dream. Men and businesses and enterprises in the United States, a new procession of conquistadores, have poured into Amazonia as if it were another far west. This U.S. invasion has inflamed the avarice of Brazilian adventurers as never before. The Indians die out, leaving no trace, and the land is sold for dollars to the new interested parties. Gold and other plentiful minerals, timber and rubber, riches whose commercial value the Indians are not even aware of, recur in the reports of each of the few investigations that have been made. It is known that the Indians have been machine gunned from helicopters and light airplanes and inoculated with smallpox virus, that dynamite has been tossed into their villages, and that they have been given gifts of sugar mixed with strychnine and salt mixed with arsenic. The director of the Indian Protection Service, named by the Castelo Branco dictatorship to clean up its administration, was himself accused, with proof, of committing 42 different kinds of crimes against the Indians. That scandal broke in 1968. Indian society in our time does not exist in a vacuum outside the general framework of the Latin American economy. There are, it is true, Brazilian tribes still sealed within the jungle, altiplano communities, totally isolated from the world, redoubts of barbarism on the Venezuelan frontier, but in general the Indians are incorporated into the system of production and the consumer market, even if indirectly. They participate in economic and social order which assigns them the role of victim, the most exploited of the exploited. They buy and sell a good part of the few things they consume and produce. At the mercy of powerful and voracious intermediaries who charge much and pay little. They are day laborers on plantations, the cheapest workforce, and soldiers in the mountains. They spend their days toiling for the world market or fighting for their conquerors. In countries like Guatemala, for example, they are at the center of national economic life. In a continuous annual cycle, they leave their, quote, sacred lands, highlands where each small farm is the size of a corpse, to contribute 200,000 pairs of hands to the harvesting of coffee, cotton, and sugar in lowlands. They are transported in trucks like cattle, and it is not always need, but sometimes liquor, that makes them decide to go. The contractors provide a marimba band and plenty of aguardiente, and the Indian sobers up. He is already in debt. And when the Indian sobers up, he will pay it off laboring on hot and strange lands which, perhaps with a few centavos in his pocket, perhaps with tuberculosis or malaria, he will leave after a few months. The army collaborates efficiently in the task of convincing the reluctant. Expropriation of the Indians, usurpation of their lands, and their labor has gone hand in hand with racist attitudes which are in turn fed by the objective degradation of civilizations broken by the conquest. The effects of the conquest and the long ensuing period of humiliation left the cultural and social identity the Indians had achieved in fragments. Yet in Guatemala, this pulverized identity is the only one that persists. It persists in tragedy. During Holy Week, processions of the Mayas produce frightful exhibitions of collective masochism. They drag heavy crosses and participate in the flagellation of Jesus step by step along the intermediate descent to Golgotha. With howls of pain, and they turn his death and his burial into a cult of their own death and their own burial, the annihilation of the beautiful life of long ago. Only there is no resurrection at the end of their Holy Week. The gold fever, which is still sentencing Amazonian Indians to death or slavery, is no novelty in Brazil. For 2 centuries after Brazil's discovery, the soil stubbornly denied metal to its Portuguese proprietors. In the first period of coastal colonization, timber or Brazil wood was commercially exploited. Then sugar plantations were started in the Northeast. In contrast to Spanish Latin America, there seemed to be no gold or silver. Having found no highly developed and organized civilization, only savage and scattered tribes who had no knowledge of metal, the Portuguese had to discover the gold on their own as they opened up the territory and exterminated its inhabitants. The Bandeirantes of Sao Paulo region had crossed the great expanse between Serra da Mantiqueira and the Rio São Francisco headwaters, and had observed small traces of alluvial gold in the beds and banks of several streams. The millennial action of the rains had eaten into the seams in the rocks and deposited gold in river beds, valleys, and mountain ravines. Beneath the layers of sand, dirt, or clay, the stony subsoil revealed nuggets that were easily removed from the quartz, cascalbo, or gravel. Methods of extraction became more complex as more superficial deposits were exhausted. Thus, the Minas Gerais region entered history with a rush. The largest amount of gold ever discovered in the world till then was extracted in the shortest space of time. Here the gold was a forest, says Beggar one meets today, his eyes scanning the church towers. There was gold on the sidewalks. It grew like grass. He is 75 years old now and considers himself part of the folklore in Mariana, the mining town where, as in nearby Oro Preto, the clock has simply stopped. Death is certain, the hour uncertain. Everyone has his time marked in the book, the beggar tells me. He spits on the stone steps and shakes his head. They had more money than they could count, he says, and if he had seen them, they didn't know where to put it, so they built churches one next to the other. Once this was the most important region of Brazil. Now, well, there is no life at all, says the old man. No young folk, they all go. His bare feet move slowly beside me under the warm afternoon sun. See that? See that on the front of that church? The sun and the moon? That means that the slaves work day and night. This church was built by black men, that one by white men, and that's the house of Monsenhor Alipio, who died right on his 99th birthday. In the 18th century, Brazilian production of the coveted metal exceeded the total volume of gold that Spain had taken from its colonies in 2 previous centuries. Adventurers and fortune hunters poured in. Brazil had 300,000 inhabitants in 1700. A century later, at the end of the gold years, the population had multiplied 11 times. No less than 300,000 Portuguese immigrated to Brazil in the 18th century. A larger contingent than Spain contributed to all Latin American colonies. From the conquest of Brazil until abolition, it is estimated that some 10 million blacks were brought from Africa. There are no precise figures for the 18th century, but the gold cycle absorbed slave labor in prodigious quantities. Salvador de Bahia was the Brazilian capital of the prosperous northeastern sugar cycle, but the Golden Age in Minas Gerais moved the country's economic and political capital southward, and Rio de Janeiro, the region's port, became the new capital in 1763. In the dynamic heart of the new mining economy, camps bloomed abruptly into cities, described by a contemporary colonial authority as sanctuaries for criminals, vagabonds, and malefactors. In the vertigo of easy riches, the Villa Rica de Oro Preto had grown to city size by 1711. Born of miners' avalanche, it was the quintessence of the gold civilization. Samayo Ferreira Machado, describing it 23 years later, said that the power of Ouro Preto businessmen surpassed by far that of Lisbon's most flourishing merchants. Hither, as to a port, are directed and collected in the royal mint the grandiose amounts of gold from all the mines. Here dwell the best educated men, both lay and ecclesiastic. Here is the seat of all the nobility and the strength of the military. It is by virtue of its natural position the head of the whole of America, and by the wealth of its riches, it is the precious pearl of Brazil. Another, end quote, another writer of the period, Francisco Tavares de Brito, in 1732, defined Ouro Preto as, quote, the Potosi of gold, end quote. Frequent complaints and protests reached Lisbon about the sinful life in Ouro Preto, Sabara, Sao Rei, Mariana, and the whole turbulent mining district. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. It was commonplace for a miner to pay a fortune for a black who played a good trumpet and twice as much for a mulatto prostitute, to abandon himself with her to continuous and scandalous sins. Men of the cloth behaved no better. Official correspondence of the time contains more complaints against bad clergymen infesting the area. They were accused of using their immunity to smuggle gold inside little wooden images of saints. It was said that in 1705, Minas Gerais did not contain one priest who was interested in the Christian faith of the people, and 6 years later the crown banned the establishment of any religious order in the mining district. In any case, There was a proliferation of handsome churches built and decorated in the bark style characteristic of the region. Minas Gerais attracted the best artisans of the time. Outwardly, the churches looked sober and austere, but the interior, symbolizing the divine soul, glistened with pure gold on their altars, reredos, pillars, and bas-relief panels. Precious metals were not spared, so that the churches could achieve, quote, the riches of heaven. As the monk Miguel de São Francisco recommended in 1710, the price of religious services was astronomical, but everything in the mining area was exorbitant, as had happened in Potosi. Oro Preto devoted himself to squandering its sudden wealth. Processions and spectacles provided occasions to exhibit splendid robes and ornaments. A religious festival in 1733 lasted over a week. There were not only processions on foot, on horseback, and in triumphal mother of pearl, silk, and gold chariots, with fantastic costumes and dazzling settings, but there were equestrian tournaments, bullfights, and dancing in the streets to the sound of flutes, flageolets, and guitars. The slaves spent their strength and their days in the gold-washing installations. There they work, wrote Luis Gomez Ferreira, a doctor who lived in Minas Gerais during the first half of the 18th century. There they eat, and often there they have to sleep. And since when they work, they are bathed in sweat, and their feet always in the cold earth, on stones or in water. When they rest or eat, their pores close, and they become so chilled that they are susceptible to many dangerous illnesses, such as very severe pleurisy, apoplectic and paralytic fits, convulsions, pneumonia, and many other diseases. The Capotes de Mato of Minas Gerais collected rewards in gold for the several heads of slaves who tried to escape. Diseases was a blessing from heaven because it meant the approach of death. The slaves were called the coins of the Indies. When they were measured, weighed, and embarked in Luanda, in the Portuguese colony of Angola, in Brazil, those surviving the ocean voyage became the hands and feet of the white master. Angola exported Bantu slaves and elephant tusks in exchange for clothing, liquor, and firearms, but Ouro Preto miners preferred blacks shipped from the little beach of Wada on the Gulf of Guinea because they were more vigorous, lasted somewhat longer, and had the magic power to find gold. Every miner was needed a black mistress from Wada to bring him luck on his expeditions. Ouro Preto's appetite for slaves became insatiable. They expired in short order, only in rare cases enduring the 7 years of continuous labor. Yet the Portuguese were meticulous in baptizing them all before they crossed the Atlantic, and once in Brazil they were obliged to attend Mass, although they were not allowed to sit in the pews or to enter the chancel. The gold explosion not only increased the importation of slaves, but absorbed a good part of the black labor from the sugar and tobacco plantations elsewhere in Brazil, leaving them without hands. The miners were contemptuous of farming, and in 1700 and 1703, in the full flush of prosperity, hunger stalked the region. Millionaires had to eat cats, dogs, rats, ants, and birds of prey. A royal decree in 1711 banned the sale of slaves occupied in agriculture, with the exception of those who showed perversity of character. By the middle of 18th century, many miners had gone to look for diamonds in Serra do Frio. The crystalline stones, the gold hunters had tossed aside while exploring the riverbeds, had turned out to be diamonds. Minas Gerais had both diamonds and gold in equal quantities. The booming camp of Tuaca, Tijuco, became the center of the diamond district, and there, as in Ouro Preto, the wealthy sported the latest European fashions, bringing luxurious clothes, weapons, and furniture from across the ocean for their hour of delirium and dissipation. A mulatto slave, Francisca da Silva, or Xikaca da Silva, won her freedom by entering the bed of millionaire João Fernandes de Oliveira, an uncrowned king of Tijuco. She was ugly and had 2 children, but became the Ica who gives orders. As she had never seen the sea and wanted it near her, her cavalheiro made her a large artificial lake on which he floated a ship complete with crew. In the São Francisco foothills He built her a castle with a garden of exotic plants and artificial waterfalls. In her honor, he gave sumptuous banquets with the finest wines, balls that never ended, and theater and concert performances. In 1818, Tijuco could still manage a large-scale celebration of the Prince of Portugal, but 10 years earlier the Englishman John Mao had visited Ouro Preto and had been startled by its poverty. He found empty and worthless houses with futile for sale signs and ate wretched and meager food. Tijuco did not take long to meet the same fate. The crisis had at first led to rebellion. Jose Joaquim da Silva Xavier, known as Tiradentes, the tooth puller, was hanged and quartered after being tortured, and other fighters for independence had disappeared from Ouro Preto into jail or exile. The gold began to flow just when Portugal signed the Methuen Treaty with England in 1703. The treaty crowned a long series of privileges obtained by British merchants in Portugal. In return for some advantages for its wines in the English market, Portugal opened its own and its colonies' markets to British manufacturers. In view of the existing inequality of industrial development, this proved disastrous for local Portuguese manufacturers. It was not with wine that English textiles were paid for, but with gold, Brazilian gold, and in the process, Portuguese looms were paralyzed. Not content with killing its own industry in the bud, Portugal destroyed the seeds of any kind of manufacturing development in Brazil. Until 1715, sugar refineries were banned. In 1729, it was made a criminal offense to open new roads in the mining region, and in 1785, local looms and spinning mills were ordered burned. England and Holland, the leading gold and slave contrabandists, amassed fortunes in the illegal black meat traffic and are said to have illicitly garnered more than half the metal the Portuguese crown was supposed to get from Brazil in Quinto Real tax. But Brazilian gold was channeled to London by illicit as well as illicit methods. The gold boom, which brought a host of Portuguese to Minas Gerais, sharply stimulated colonial demand for industrial products and at the same time provided the means to pay for them. Just as Potosi silver rebounded off Spanish soil, Minas Gerais gold only reached Portugal in transit. The metropolis became an intermediary. In 1755, the Marquis de Pombal, Portugal's prime minister, tried to revive a protectionist policy, but it was too late. He declared that the English had conquered Portugal without the trouble of a conquest, that they were supplying two-thirds of its needs, and that British agents controlled the whole of Portuguese trade. Portugal was producing almost nothing, and the wealth brought by gold was so illusory that even the black slaves who mined it were clothed by the British. Celso Furtado had noted that Britain, following a far-sighted policy with respect to industrial development, used Brazilian gold to pay for essential imports from other countries and could thus concentrate on investments in the manufacturing sector. Thanks to this historical graciousness on the part of the Portuguese, Britain could apply rapid and efficient technical innovations. Europe's financial center moved from Amsterdam to London. According to British sources, the value of Brazilian gold arriving in London reached 50,000 a week in some periods. Without this 50,000 pounds a week in some periods. Without this tremendous accumulation of gold reserves, Britain would not have been able later on to confront Napoleon. No result of the dynamic stimulus of gold remained on Brazilian soil except churches and works of art. By the end of the 18th century, although the diamond supply was still not exhausted, the colony was prostrate. Furtado calculates that at that time, the low point of the whole colonial period, the per capita income of the 3 million odd Brazilians did not exceed $58 a year in today's buying power. Minas Gerais drowned in a long wave of decadence and insolvency. Incredibly, a modern Brazilian author expresses gratitude for the favor and submits that the capital the English derived from Minas Gerais aided the great banking network that built international trade and made it possible to raise the living standards of peoples capable of progress. End quote. Inexorably condemned to poverty so that foreigners might progress. The incapable mining communities mouldered in isolation and could only resign themselves to scraping a livelihood from lands already despoiled of metals and precious stones. Subsistence farming replaced mining. Today, the Minas Gerais countryside, like the Northeast, is the kingdom of the latifundio and the hacienda colonels, or colonels, I guess it's colonels. A dauntless bastion of backwardness, the sale of Minas Gerais workers to haciendas in other states is almost as common as the slave traffic in the Northeast. Recently, Franklin de Oliveira toured Minas Gerais. He found collapsing wooden huts, villages without water or light, prostitutes of an average age of 13 on the road in the valley of the Yaquinhona, the crazed and farmish people along the roadsides. Minas Gerais was once accurately described as having a heart of gold and a breast of iron, but its fabulous iron quadrilateral is being exploited today by a joint Anna Mining Company Bethlehem Steel Enterprise. The deposits were surrendered in a sinister deal in 1964. The iron in foreigners' hands will leave no more behind than did the gold. Only the explosion of artistic talent remains as a memento of the golden delirium. Apart from the holes in the ground and the abandoned cities, nor could Portugal salvage anything creative except for the aesthetic revolution. The convent of Mafra, pride of Dom Juan V, lifted Portugal from artistic decadence in its carillons of 37 bells and its solid gold vessels and candelabra. There still glints the gold of Minas Gerais. The Minas churches have been extensively plundered, and few sacred objects of portable size remain in them. The monumental Baroque works still rise above the colonial ruins, facades and pulpits, galleries, reredos, human figures designed, carved, or sculpted by Antonio Francisco Lisboa, Ale Giardino, little cripple, genius son of a female slave and a famous artisan. The 18th century was coming to a close when Galeano began carving in stone a group of large sacred figures in the garden of the Bom Jesus do Mato Sinhos Church in Congonhos do Campo. The work was called The Prophets, but there was no longer any glory in prophesying. The gold euphoria was a thing of the past. All the pomp and gaiety had vanished, and there was no room for hope. This dramatic final testimony, like a grand monument to the fleeting gold civilizations that was born to die, was left to succeeding generations by the most talented artists in all of Brazil's history. Alejandro, disfigured and crippled by leprosy, created his masterpiece with chisel and hammer tied to fingerless hands, dragging himself on his knees to his workshop every morning. Legend insists that in the Nossa Senhora das Mercês, a Misericordia church in Minas Gerais, dead miners still celebrate Mass on cold, rainy nights. When the priest turns around, raising his arms from the high altar, one sees the bones of his face.